these people say, well, Satanists, they kill children in satanic rituals, and they get away with it because the police cover it up. I'm aware of children being killed in rituals, and those rituals are always exorcisms. All right, there's always someone does an exorcism of a child and they kill it. And recently, there was a case. I think it was in San Diego. Someone killed, I think, a 5-year-old, and they were trying to defend the murder of this 5-year-old on religious freedom grounds, and saying, well, if you persecute us for killing our child in an exorcism, that goes against our religious beliefs. This is never going to get any traction in the court. But again, it's this profound projection, right? You are the people killing your children, and you're accusing some kind of imaginary conspiracy of doing the exact same thing.
Solomon and Smith. Hello, welcome to Solomon and Smith.
Bleib saftig, große Jungs.
You're about to listen to a conversation between me, Milo, and Joe Laycock. Joe Laycock is a religious studies professor in Texas, an interestingly shaped state. I like the Texas border being a mixture of natural border shapes, squiggly things, and then really flat lines on the top.
Classic American flat line state divisions, which are actually spiritually true. You don't see any border disputes among the American states. You have to ask why. It's because they are absolutely accurate to something we human eyes cannot actually perceive.
Joe Laycock. Not the British Army general.
We did no verification on whether or not the man we spoke to was a British Army general.
He's an associate professor at Texas State University. He holds a MTS, whatever the hell that is, from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD from Boston University.
And he's seen a lot of movies, a lot of scary movies.
I imagine Harvard Divinity School just, teaching the American elites how to become divinities. Joe writes about similar things to Sean McLeod. Demon fears, satanic fears in contemporary America, contemporary US stuff. In particular, how pop culture has influenced lots of these religious beliefs and practices.
What's interesting about the book he co-wrote, The Exorcist Effect, is the very specific and literal way in which films like The Exorcist have gone on to influence demonic practices and things like exorcisms, which before the film were almost unheard of in the US. And after the film, became something of a mainstay. Inexplicably, we also talk quite a lot about lizard people and their reality, where they live, what they look like, whether lizards, on the ground, if they're sort of involved or just neutral.
To facilitate infinite... To
facilitate
infinite Solomon and Smith, click on the Patreon link down below. In exchange for your support, you do get a lot of extra stuff. You get the cream of the mental crops, 45 minutes to an hour of extra material every episode. Please also like this video, leave a comment, and if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. It's genuinely helpful.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Joseph. Your profile picture on your academic landing page is a beardless man, but we see before us today a bearded man.
This is my COVID look. This is how I started to look during COVID lockdown, and my wife liked it, so it stuck.
Yeah, when you go back to clean shaven after a beard period, people do look at you funny. It's a weird moment. This meeting almost thwarted by the real Antichrist walking among us, daylight savings. I think the best evidence of us actually being run by a cadre of satanic elites is the continuation of daylight savings. I don't understand it. Just wake up earlier. Just wake up later. I've never heard a convincing argument why you can't just adjust the time you're waking up. Farmers. Is it about farmers? I can't remember.
It used to be about farmers, but my understanding is it was the the corporations who said people will shop more if it's light out. So it's
Ah,
always
They're at it
capitalism.
again.
I hate
They're at it
those
again.
guys. Oh,
I told it was for Scottish school children walking to school in the morning. This was the lie they fed me, and I believed it.
yeah, we get the nice, like, non-cynical version where it's about the poor Scottish urchins who just want to learn. And the version you get is the guys at the top just keeping us down. Wasn't it Ben Franklin who introduced it? A Freemason?
That's right. Yeah, I believe it
Yeah.
was.
I learned that from the movie National Treasure. Nicolas Cage,
A
various
lot of
other
wisdom, a
actors.
lot of wisdom in that film.
Yeah, we start these chats with a poetic epigraph, and I just need to look for that poem in the movie The Omen. Um, Wait, I forgot to copy and paste it, so there's going to be some impromptu clicking around. But I don't know who wrote it. Did you know anything about like where this poem comes from in The Omen? Was it just the guy who wrote the script?
Yeah, it begins when the Jews return to Zion and a comet strikes the sky.
Yeah.
Something,
Would you
something,
like to
you and
read
I
it?
must
No, no, yeah,
die.
I thought you were
Uh,
looking.
yeah, that was written by David Seltzer, who was a secular Jew, and he'd never read the New Testament or the Book of Revelation. He said, "This is wild," and he just made up this poem. And because lots of Americans are biblically illiterate, they all assumed it must really be in the Bible.
Yeah, goodness me, what am I? People have written poems about the Omen that I'm now scrolling through to try to get to the one from the film. This one's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll just read this random poem by someone about the film The Omen. Nanny's dead, a lifeless bouquet of limbs, wilting in front of the window. Needs deadheading. The flower's gone, the thorn remains. An anonymous poem, as if on a sort of medieval rune. Um, and yeah, I think it adds a bit of mystique to the poem that we couldn't find it. It's ungoogleable. Poem, The Omen movie, 1970. Yeah, so we're here to talk about various things today, Joe. We're going to sort of talk around various topics around your book, The Exorcist Effect, a book that's sort of comically well researched, considering how sort of trashy and schlocky so much of the material is that you're dealing with. I'm going to start with the same question that we asked to Sean McLeod, who's working in a similar kind of field to you. What was your kind of religious background, your cultural background that led you to this general field of study that you're working in today?
Yeah, so I grew up Roman Catholic. Catholics are uh, the most depicted religion in these films, and I have never renounced Catholicism. Although I consider myself a pretty relaxed Catholic, but that gave me an insight into people like William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist, who was also Catholic and writing at a Catholic institution.
Yeah, and in terms of these films that you're looking at, in terms of the horror genre more broadly, is this stuff like from your childhood, from your teens? Were you always kind of into horror movies or interested in the way they affected people?
I really got into this in graduate school, actually. I took a class on
Mm.
American religious history, and we were assigned to read The Exorcist, which, of course, is not history. It's a fictional novel written in 1971. But the professor said this is actually a very interesting snapshot of the American religious landscape when it was written in 1971. So you can see in that novel the anxiety that Christianity is dying out in America, which was believed in 1971, anxiety over the arrival of religions from Asia coming into California and being picked up by the hippies, people experimenting with things like Ouija boards and the human potential movement. So I wrote a term paper on William Peter Blatty and his influences on The Exorcist, and that was one of the first things that I ever published as a journal article. And this idea of this kind of feedback loop between horror movies and actual religious cultures kind of started with that paper.
And in terms of your interest both in what's the word, sort of stigmatized fringe religious movements and your interest in sort of stigmatized lowbrow media, um, how do they intersect, and what value do you find in what you're doing personally?
Yeah, so my field of religious studies, we often bemoan what we call the world religions paradigm, which is the idea that there are sort of eight great religions in the world or five great religions in the world. And on the one hand, we know there are historical reasons that people kind of have this model of world religion. But as much as may complain about it, if you want to get hired as a religious studies professor, you need to be specialized in Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. If you study, Satanism or Scientology or Wicca or something like this, you're not going to get a job.
Hmm.
And so those sort of minority religions and often controversial religions have are more likely to be studied by sociologists. And here in the United States, we had a period called the Cult Wars in the 1970s when there were allegations of brainwashing and an attempt to sort of medicalize being part of the wrong religion. So this field of new religious movements emerged out of that. My frustration as I started doing research was I kept getting very interested in these weird kind of niche little religions and projects that no one had ever published on before, and being told, well, this isn't, proper religion. This isn't important.
Yeah.
This is new religious movements. And you can say it's not important, but, I live in Texas. The events of Waco, Texas in 1993 with the Branch Davidians was a case that I think showed pretty profoundly you have to have a working knowledge of even the weird little religions because those are the ones where there is the most opportunity to really screw things up. That was a case where over 80 people were killed unnecessarily. And horror movies also, it's been described as sort of a ghettoized a genre, a movie that's kind of not taken seriously. But what I have attempted to show in the book is a lot of people have kind of very real experiences and
Hmm.
very real kind of interactions with the world in ways that are framed and molded by watching these horror movies. So whether we personally think these things are tasteful or high art or whatever, I think that we ignore them at our peril.
Hmm. What's the logic within religious studies departments for concentrating on the big religions? Is it solely cultural heritage, solely we've always done it this way? You always study Hinduism and Islam and Christianity, or it is, I suppose I'm asking what the internal kind of logic is for studying religion in general and it not being theology, quite it being religious studies or religious education, a slightly different tack. Why is this a field of study in general, and why might that be a reason why Satanism or whatever isn't a part of it?
Yeah, this word religion is not a very old word, and it begins in Europe during the early modern period. And it doesn't really necessarily translate to other cultures, but basically in Europe you had the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants at the same time that Europeans were having an age of exploration and going and discovering other cultures. And so there was this kind of moment of we went to India. And these people have a big building with their gods that they go to, and they have
Mm,
scriptures. This kind of reminds us of Christianity. This must be their religion. But Indians wouldn't have thought about it that way at that time, right? They would have said, well, this is Dharma. This is the way that the universe works. They didn't have this category of religion. And so then the study of religion really begins with people in Europe who are being brought these sacred texts from other parts of the world and comparing them to the Bible. So they're reading the Bible, they're reading the Quran, they're reading the scriptures of Hinduism and Buddhism. But if your culture does not have some kind of text like that that can be sent back to Europe, then what you were doing would generally not have been perceived as religion. It would have been perceived as kind of, heathenism or idolatry or something like this. And so to this day,
mm,
if you study, say, Native American traditions, you are more likely to work in a department of anthropology than in a religious studies department. And so we're all kind of stuck in these tracks that were created hundreds of years ago that don't really make any sense anymore. But the academy doesn't really change very quickly at all. In fact, when we go to graduation, we're still wearing medieval robes at graduation. That's where those come from. So we're still kind of stuck in this outmoded paradigm.
And it resembles horror films a little bit in how they're often accepted from sort of your big prestigious award shows. I mean, it's a bad year to say this because you have something like Sinners up for so many awards, but it is there almost by exception. It's like it's the one that made it through. Typically, they have their own award shows and they have their own fan base. There was a classic phrase people used to say, perhaps less so now, after you've had this kind of a heightened version of horror. But people would say, they love all movies except horrors and musicals, as though these guys don't belong with the main pack. They're something that just goes for the kind of emotional reaction. But it reminds me of this sense. They don't have a text. They don't have this meaningful center, which is not really an accurate reproduction of what they're doing. And I think The Exorcist, which is kind of your nexus point for the work, I mean, the title of the work is a great one because it wasn't that at the time. It won Oscars. It like almost swept the nominations and won a few. It was just considered a good film. Whereas now, so much of its grammar has been borrowed, stolen, and contorted. If you watched it today, you might think, oh, someone went out to make a horror film, which I feel isn't quite accurate. But what do you think about that transformation, The Exorcist, from almost a prestigious blockbuster, huge hit, now retrospectively almost schlocky?
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name of the director who did
If,
Sinners, but I heard an interview and
yeah.
he said that he's upset about the concept of genre in films, and he even compared it to the segregation laws in America during the Jim Crow era, right? Where if your skin is this shade, the following rules apply to you. He said, to me, Jurassic Park is one of the greatest horror movies of all time, but no one considers Steven Spielberg to be someone who directs horror movies. So yeah, when I show The Exorcist to my students, they often are approaching it through the frame of it's an old horror movie. And so they assume that it's going to be this really terrible, badly done movie with bad special effects. And if that's what you expect to see, and if you're watching it on your laptop while also talking to your roommate, that's what you'll find, right? It's they come to class and they say this was the dumbest movie ever. This was a comedy. And they say, well, it's really not, right? It's actually a pretty good movie, but you have to kind of suspend your assumptions about what you're about to watch.
I think a
Yeah,
good primer for The Exorcist is to describe it as sadder than it is scary. I think the whole scariest film ever made thing, which at the time seemed to be quite true, and I know there are people even today who struggle with it. They've had a spiritual upbringing, religious upbringing, but I think it's really quite there is a real sadness in a lot of it in the subjects it's discussing. And I think you look at it that way. Most of it isn't head spinning around green sick. That's only like a small portion. And if you take the rest of the movie, it's not just build up to that, but it's a reflection on this child who's very likely been abused and the kind of fallout of this and the kind of scientific mechanistic way of trying to understand it. Now, in the frame of The Exorcist and how it's the big turning point in the text, I'm curious how you describe American religion and American Catholicism before The Exorcist, particularly regarding the rite of the exorcism itself, which in the film is considered this kind of obscure, dated thing. You can't get a priest to do it. Was that the reality?
Yes, it was. So prior to The Exorcist, there are only two Catholic exorcisms in American history that we know about. That doesn't count Spanish missionaries in the Spanish colonies in the Southwest. There were almost certainly more exorcisms than that, but they were always kept a carefully guarded secret. The Catholic Church didn't want anyone to know that they were doing exorcisms. In both cases, these leaked. And so the United States has historically been a Protestant majority country for all of its history. And so Catholics were seen as immigrants, immigrants coming from Italy and Ireland and Mexico, and were seen as superstitious and kind of incompatible with democracy. The idea was if you were loyal to the Pope and the Pope lives in Rome, how can you ever be a proper American citizen? So the Catholic Church in America was doing everything that it could to kind of fight back against this stereotype of the superstitious Catholic immigrant. And so in 1971, when Chris McNeil goes to Father Karras and says, I want an exorcism, and he says, well, the first thing you need is a time machine. It's not done anymore. That's completely accurate. That's exactly what would have happened. What's really interesting is after The Exorcist came out, there was this massive demand for exorcisms all over the United States and in the UK as well. And the Catholic Church initially said, well, we don't do this. And then they saw, well, these people are going to the Pentecostals. They're going to
Mm.
Protestant deliverance ministers. And so we're going to lose market share. So they flipped very quickly from we never talk about exorcism to we are the exorcism church, right? Come to us with your demons.
Yeah, did what's Blatty drawing on in the novel? I know there's this case from earlier, from a few decades earlier that he's drawing on, but is some of this, at least some of this, coming purely from his imagination? Some of the stuff in the novel?
Yes, so he was graduating from Georgetown University, which is a Jesuit university. It's run by Catholic priests. The year that the Washington Post broke this story about a local boy who was having an exorcism, and Blatty at the time said, I actually hope this is real. I hope this boy is actually possessed by the devil, because if he is, that means if there's a devil, there's a God, and that means I haven't wasted every morning getting up and going to church. So he graduated, he worked for the Foreign Service for a while, and I saw William Peter Blatty speak here in Austin, and they asked him, why is the demon Pazuzu, which is a real kind of Mesopotamian demon or entity. And he said, well, because when I was in the Foreign Service, I went to a museum and I saw the statue and it scared the hell out of me. So that's why Pazuzu is the demon in the movie. And then he wrote comedy. So he mostly was a comedy writer. And then at the end of the
Mm.
1960s, there was this huge demand for paperback horror novels. And he said, well, I'd always wanted to write about this exorcism that happened my senior year of college. And the exorcism was performed by Jesuits. So he had friends from college who were Jesuits, priests, and he sort of got information about the exorcism through their network. And the family said, we don't want to revisit this ever. We don't want you to write a novel about what happened to our family. So he changed the protagonist from being a young boy to a young girl. And then Father Thomas Birmingham, who actually appears in The Exorcist, said, I'm going to help you research Catholic demonology only
Mm.
because the movie Rosemary's Baby was so deeply offensive to Catholics that if you're going to make a horror movie or a horror novel, I want it to actually sort of depict Catholicism correctly. So Blatty really did do a study of exorcism texts and demonology. If you read the novel The Exorcist, Father Karras is going to the library and reading all these books. Those are all real books that William Peter Blatty read. There was also a case that happened in Erling, Iowa in 1928. And if you read that account, one of the things that it says is, we've had this woman tied to a bed. She's barely eating anything. And yet somehow she's able to projectile vomit, gallons of fluid, even though she hasn't been eating or drinking anything. How is this possible? So that's a direct influence on The Exorcist. And in the 80s, Blatty finally said, look, the story is pretty much from my imagination, right? I borrowed elements from these two real life cases, but it's mostly from my imagination. But Warner Brothers really wanted to hit hard this note of this is all real. This is all a true story. This is all based on true events. And we have surveys from the 1970s where a lot of Americans did assume this was all real, that this was a true story, that maybe this was a fictionalized account, but that essentially the Exorcist is not a novel. It's a documentary.
Do we know what attracted Friedkin to the subject matter, or indeed Polanski to Rosemary's Baby? Both of them have similar backgrounds as their secular Jewish families who fled Europe, came to America, and both of them, don't really have a meat in the game, so to speak. That secular Jews looking at this story. Do we have any notion of what necessarily attracted them to the material and some of the ways they might have changed it? Maybe specifically on The Exorcist.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
understanding is that they were both requested, right, to direct these
Mm.
movies. So Rosemary's Baby, this person William Castle wanted to direct it, who was
Yes,
known
of the
for
Tingler fame.
the
Yeah, that's
Tingler, right?
yeah,
He was
yeah.
called the King of Corn, and thought this is my chance to make real art. And the studio said we're
Jealous
only
of
gonna.
Hitchcock, looking at Hitchcock. Why does he get credibility and not me, the director of the Tingler?
That's right. So they said we're only going to do this if you work with Roman Polanski. We need a serious director to make this movie. And similarly, when William Peter Blatty was able to negotiate his own contract with Warner Brothers, he said, "I want William Friedkin specifically because William Friedkin was known for this style called the hyperreal,
Mm.
where the sound effects are often so loud that they are painful to the audience." Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
he would have real car crashes in his
Mm,
movies.
mm.
He would cast non-actors, so he liked to cast actual police, actual priests. At the end of The Exorcist, Father Karras falls down these stairs, and his fellow priest, Father Dyer, finds his body. Father Dyer was played by an actual priest who was actually a high school drama teacher at a Catholic high school. So what a coup for the high school drama teacher. And so he's supposed to be kind of cradling his friend, and William Friedkin says, "No, no, no, you're supposed to look shocked." And then William
Mm.
Friedkin slaps him across the face and says, "There, that's the face you're supposed to have." So I tell my students actual priests were harmed in the making of this film.
Yeah. Do you think there's a level of irony or detachment in their handling of the material? Like, I find both films extremely straightforward, and okay, Rosemary's Baby, maybe there's a slight hint of irony, but in The Exorcist, I think it's pretty straightforward. But I don't know. I wonder whether you read it differently, whether you think there's a slightly ironic touch in there.
Yeah, I don't think there's any irony intended. There is Kinderman, the detective character, and there's this sort of, comic relief there. You can see bits and pieces of Blatty as a comedy a writer. And I think his initial script was like 3 hours long, and they had to cut out a lot of that sort of stuff. But for Blatty, he insisted that this is kind of his take on theology, right? He said that this is a film about the mystery of goodness. That was his idea, that sort of all the terrible things in the world paradoxically point to this idea that there is some kind of transcendent force for good that's looking out for us. And I think Friedkin just wanted to make a great film, a film that would sort of add to his fame and his acclaim. I saw Friedkin near the end of his life. He made this documentary called "The Devil and Father Amorth," about an actual exorcist. It was a very strange documentary, but he kind of ginned up this narrative of, well, look, I'm just a secular Jewish guy, and even I am starting to think there's something actually supernatural
Yeah, yeah.
going on here, and that may have just been, he wanted to get people excited about this kind of low effort project that he was putting out.
Yeah, there seems to be a sort of fallacy that highbrow people like cardinals or university professors or even priests are not affected by lowbrow media, whether it's cheap pulp novels or adverts or social media slop or silly movies or YouTube videos. Do you think the layer of embarrassment, if not shame, if you're a tenured sort of Ivy League professor watching The Conjuring 3, might make you more susceptible to being subconsciously influenced by such a film?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Yeah. I don't know. I think that a lot of humanities professors are open to the idea that they can watch schlock in a thoughtful way. So there's a very successful book in my field called The Gospel of Oprah, and it was written by an Ivy League religious studies professor who was watching the Oprah Winfrey show and sort of thinking about how this might be influencing people. But we are susceptible to these types of influences, just like everybody else is. I interviewed Diana Pasulka for this project, who was a consultant on the Conjuring films. And as she explained it, her background is in medieval Catholicism, and the Conjuring producers said, we're doing an exorcism. We want the church Latin to be correct. That's why we want your help.
Okay.
And when she actually showed up on set, they said, everyone, this is the demonologist. Everybody get on Twitter and say there's a real demonologist wandering around the sets. But she wrote this book called American Cosmic, where she is describing UFOs and she says someone blindfolded her and took her to a UFO crash site. And this is a serious religion professor. And so some people kind of raise the sort of questions that you're asking of is this naivety? This is either genius or being kind of duped by some just disingenuous
Yeah.
people. But Diana Pasulka is a smart person, regardless of how she ended up blindfolded at a UFO crash site looking for debris.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder whether like some of the appeal, I mean, I just from the outside of looking into people with really heterodox and extreme beliefs is a slight amount of, if not jealousy, then at least like hyper fascination, what it's like to feel or believe something so intensely. I don't know, I feel like at least with myself, I feel like it's very easy for me to put cynical holes through things. And I look at people at UFO crash sites with blindfolds on, and a little part of me thinks like, maybe you have got it right. Maybe you are living life to the fullest. Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting position to be in. And also that it's another thing about religious studies in general is if you can categorize things, if you are able to write books about things, surely that means they're not going into you. Surely that means, I'm studying the Oprah Winfrey show. I'm not. Oprah Winfrey's not getting into my subconscious. I've written the book about how she does it. I don't know. Yeah, I wonder whether something like this is going on in some cases.
Yeah, I think you're probably onto something, right? And some people said, well, this does seem a little snobbish, right, for someone, an Ivy League professor, to take television that's important to working class people and say,
Hmm.
well, I'm just watching it, to see how bad it is, or something like this, right? It's
Important
also
study.
right to study it, right? And it's also true that a lot of religion, if you study world religion for a while, it becomes very difficult to believe anything with conviction because you've seen
Hmm.
all the different varieties of beliefs and approaches to the world that millions of people have had over thousands of years. And so, in my experience, a lot of religious studies professors will say things like, "Well, this is my tradition that I belong to, but I'm agnostic or I'm religiously confused." And so I do think there is a kind of envy of people that will just say, I am a Pentecostal, I have the fire of Jesus, and I know exactly how the universe works. I know what's going to happen to my soul when I die. I know what's going to happen to your soul when you die.
Yeah.
And I think that there is an idea. This is kind of these people are more interesting to study, right, than say kind of a mainline Episcopalian church where they say, well, we're really just about being good people. That might be more agreeable, but it's less interesting as a subject of study.
And is
Yeah.
there something we can get out of these horror films, especially the ones that are better made? When you're watching Rosemary's Baby, even as the kind of art cynic, you do believe it in the time because that's the point of the drama is you believe the walls are closing in and you know the doctor's smelling of fungus and what that means. And you're aware that the husband has sold his soul for a all of that within the frame of the film is true, and you can suspend yourself somewhat to believe it. And then I suppose the subject of the book is when this suspension breaks and it leaks out after the film, and you leave thinking that John Cassavetes shouldn't have sold his soul to the devil. It was the movie, but there is because art sort of pulls from reality, and then some reality pours out, but you might get the wrong part. I think in Rosemary's Baby there is truth. It's just not the literal kind of truth. Though I
Hmm.
was curious earlier, you mentioned that the Catholics are very unhappy with Rosemary's Baby. Can you get into the specifics of what in their kind of demonics were incorrect and needed to be shored up?
Sure. So when William Castle purchased the right to the novel by Ira Levin, his wife said, "Boy, the Catholics are not going to like this." And William Castle sort of went, yes, they're going to get really angry and they're going to protest it. We're going to make lots of money. And so the Catholic Church in America has been involved in the film industry for a long time. You know, they had an organization called the League of Decency that would rate movies. And the Catholic Church gave Rosemary's Baby a rating of C, which stands for condemned. So they
Not
condemned the film.
mediocre, just
That's right.
condemned.
And I don't actually, I don't really get why they were so upset about it, but they said this is mocking the birth of Jesus, which I mean I guess so. And they didn't like the depiction of Satanism. There is this scene where Rosemary, who is a lapsed Catholic, has this strange dream, and the Pope is speaking to her in this kind of hallucinogenic dream. But they really didn't like this. And what's interesting is in their review where they condemned it, they said the technical excellence of the film makes the blasphemy even worse. So in other words, if
Magnified.
this had been a terrible B movie, it wouldn't be as bad. But it's actually a good movie, and it's talking about things that we don't think the public should be exposed to.
I think it's often curious. You get, I think, especially in the sort of evangelical wings, people who not only dislike this kind of film, but think that it is itself subject to possession or kind of demonically inspired, and that you shouldn't watch it, shouldn't go close to it. And it does seem to affect people of extreme spiritual beliefs more. But by and large, these movies tend to be sympathetic to those people, which is to say they are right, evil is bad, and we will fight against it. And fair enough, Rosemary's Baby, Satan wins, and The Omen, Satan wins. But in The Exorcist, goodness wins, God wins. And it's surprising that all of these films that are basically, they're like buttressing up the notions of these slightly fringe religious types are films they often reject. I feel like they could really get on board with it. It's like, yes, this is it. This is a vision of the evil we're facing, and it does depict it as evil. It's not sort of from the devil's point of view. Do you think there is a contradiction in this interaction between the people on whom the film is based and the way they tend to interpret it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, partly the ending of The Exorcist is confusing to people. I think some people saw that and they said, so both the priests are dead. So it seems like the devil won, right? Devil two, priests nothing. But of course, Reagan is no longer possessed, and really, this is about Father Karras's a loss of faith. And Father Karras is a stand-in for William Peter Blatty, who's also hoping to have some kind of evidence that the supernatural exists. And Father Karras is such a skeptic that even when supernatural things are happening, he's saying, "Well, this is just psychic powers, combined with mental illness." And so when he gets possessed, when he invites the demon into him, now he finally has direct empirical knowledge of, okay, it's really a demon, it's really all real. And in the novel, it describes him having this incredible look of peace on his face when he's dead, because he finally, at the last second, got his faith confirmed. So I think Blatty meant it as a story where good wins, where good triumphs over evil. And when this movie came out, it was condemned by a lot of religious people, including Billy Graham, this very famous American evangelical who was involved with prayer breakfasts in Washington, D.C., and had a lot of influence. And he said, the very celluloid of the film is evil. So if you don't watch it, if you're just
Whoa.
next to it, you're in danger. And congressmen would tell him, "Oh, you're right, Billy Graham. In fact, if there's a theater that's showing The Exorcist, I go around it, for 4 blocks or something. So I don't have to go by it." But as much as he was saying all of this, I think that he was secretly pleased. I think Billy Graham was secretly very happy that everyone was talking about the devil and being very anxious about the devil, because really that served his purposes, right? If people are scared of the devil, who's going to protect them? It's going to be Billy Graham, and they're going to do what he tells them to do.
Yeah, I mean, at least the surface level reading of The Exorcist, it's pretty excellent Christian propaganda, no? You don't walk away from it thinking like, I don't know, feeling indifferent. At least if you're engaging with it, if you're not on the laptop and talking to friends and thinking what a lot of nonsense. I mean, if you really get into that film, you have to ask yourself, do I believe in the devil afterwards? And even asking that question is already walking in the direction of the church. If you're in this 1970s hyper secular mindset, if you're in this "is God dead" mindset, the Time magazine cover that we see Mia Farrow holding in Rosemary's Baby. Yeah, it is extraordinary that that yeah that the opposition to these films by the people whose case is they're making much worse than the film is making. I don't know. Yeah, it's so unusual to me. Yeah, in the 1960s, maybe sort of starting with Psycho, horror movies do have this brief period of going from schlock to being a bit more of a respected genre. And it probably starts with Psycho in 1960, where sort of the old campy thrills of a William Castle style 50s film are replaced by thrills which feel much more visceral and horrifying. There's a funny interview with Peter Bogdanovich where he talks about waiting outside a movie theater where Psycho was playing. And about half an hour in, when the shower scene happened, he said the crowd started screaming, but not like spread screams, like ah, ah, but one continuous ah, continuously for about 5 minutes. It was just the level that films were able to get into people suddenly seems to just, specifically in the horror genre, just takes off with Psycho. And other directors look at this reaction that Hitchcock has received and are quite jealous of it, quite jealous of the amount that he was able to elicit these enormous responses from people. People running up the aisle, people vomiting, people locking themselves in their office and crying there for a week. Like the whole reception history of Psycho is crazy. What do you think made America by 1960 ready for this kind of visceral horror?
Well, so Psycho, like The Exorcist, is loosely based on a true story, right? It's loosely based on this murderer named Ed Gein, who would collect body parts and make things out of them, right? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is also based on the same individual. But the other thing is that where Hitchcock was really brilliant is he said when people go to a horror film, they expect there to be spooky castles and thunderstorms and this sort of thing. And I'm going to get rid of all of that. I'm going to make this seem as much as possible like something that could really happen. And I think that that was part of why people were so drawn to Hitchcock's movies, especially Psycho, because it felt like this is something that's going on in the real world. This is not something happening in Transylvania or something like that.
And even in The Birds, which is quasi supernatural, it's played as if birds could just randomly all attack us for natural reasons.
That's right. And even if you don't find that to be a very plausible scenario, birds do act strange sometimes, right? We've all had a moment
It's
like, what
true.
exactly
It's
are the
true.
birds doing? Right?
What what goes on in the mind of birds? And it's impossible. I defy anyone to watch the movie The Birds, walk outside, look at some birds, and feel normal about them.
Well, here in Texas, we have a species called the grackle, and they're everywhere in urban areas. And every night around dusk, all of the grackles congregate together and shriek. And scientists don't know why they do this, but visitors to Texas say, "What is happening? This is terrifying. There are 300 birds outside my window, and they are all shrieking."
And they're called grackle.
They're called
Yeah.
grackles. Yeah.
So by
Yeah.
the latter half of the 60s, we get to Rosemary's Baby in this new tradition being founded, and this is mentioned in your book. And do we already with Rosemary's Baby see this after effect? Do we see people acting differently, believing things? Is this sort of where Hollywood demon thing comes from? Or again, how much is it playing into what people already believed or producing new beliefs and all this stuff about witchcraft and these I imagine these are made up texts referenced in the film, but they seem rather real. And I think some of like the Tanis route or whatnot were these things that then came into being.
Right. So tannis fruit is not real. But the Church of Satan formed in San Francisco in 1966 with this
Ah,
fellow
okay.
Anton LaVey. As far as I can tell, he was invited to the premiere of Rosemary's Baby, and he showed up in a hearse. But he told people that, he was a consultant on the film, which he apparently wasn't. He told them that he played the devil. There's a scene where Rosemary is basically raped by the devil, and that was him in the devil costume, and that's been pretty much debunked as well. So there was an idea when the movie came out that Satanism's a real thing. There are actually people out there who are Satanists. There were very few movies prior to Rosemary's Baby that actually depicted satanic cults. There's only a couple of them. One of the big ones is the Black Cat that had Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff in it. But then, after Rosemary's Baby comes out, we have the Manson murders, and the director's pregnant wife is murdered by the Manson family. And Polanski kind of leaned into it, and he told a police officer, "Well, this might have been some kind of witchcraft." So those two
Mm.
events, Rosemary's Baby combined with the Manson family, that very rapidly is kind of the origin of this conspiracy theory that there are violent satanic cults all over America, and that just gets stronger and stronger. And really, you can draw a straight line from that all the way to QAnon and people saying that Hillary Clinton drinks children's blood under a pizza parlor.
Mm. Something which Milo pointed out, because he's been rewatching lots of these films, is the emphasis on showbiz, on acting, on filmmaking in The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. I wonder if could you develop that a bit, Milo?
Yeah, well, it was also not only showbiz and acting and pretending to do things, but also we get the sense of filmmaking and photography is important. You go in The Omen, and we have this photojournalist whose camera can see things the human eye cannot, and there's a sense of objectivity in the camera image. And we get the ending of The Exorcist where you can finally know, but then The Omen gives you, well, look, the camera says it has to be true, and they can go on for the rest of the film with a kind of certainty. And obviously, we are watching a film. The thing is self-referential, but I wonder how much that comes into play when you're looking at these films, because then later on we get The Conjuring, and then so much of The Conjuring is set up about documenting the things that are happening. This is crucial. We've got to set the cameras up with all the tripwires, all these kind of recording softwares, and this becomes maybe a much bigger part. In The Exorcist, they say, well, we have to prove it. We have to get this tape recorder to a bishop, and he can sign off the Exorcist. But
Mm.
then by the time we get to The Conjuring and maybe the exorcism of Emily Rose, the proof is all of it. It's all about how can we record this? How can we prove it? And
Paranormal
again,
activity as well. Yeah.
exactly. And it's all in found footage and all this stuff. But even in The Exorcist, right at the beginning, and Rosemary's Baby, there is this proximity to filming, to pretending, to acting. So what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation. I would add to that in The Exorcist, Father Karras is recording his interview with Reagan, and it's all just sort of groaning. And then when he plays it backwards, now you can hear the demon speaking. And I really do think that is either the direct origin or certainly contributed to this obsession in the 1970s with playing records
Led
backwards
Zeppelin and yeah.
and trying to they call it backmasking, right? Trying to hear hidden messages. And what's funny is some artists actually did have backmasked messages, and no one found those. But they played the ones with no backmasking and convinced themselves that they heard, satanic messages. So I think you're right that there is this kind of preoccupation with new media as being kind of a way to see into the supernatural world. And I think that's happened with pretty much every new form of information technology that's come out, going back to probably the telegraph in the 1800s
Or
of
indeed the
can't,
book. The book. Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, right. The idea of, well, books are things that the wizards and witches have, right? People who can read are not to be trusted, right? Yeah, I think that's fair. But immediately, as soon as we get new technology, we're like, well, can we use it to talk to ghosts? Can we use it to talk to the dead? And then, of course, with the Conjuring films, they were based on the careers of Ed and Lorraine Warren, And from what I could tell, they would go to colleges and they would be paid to kind of show their evidence to college students. And they got huge turnouts, and this was basically YouTube before YouTube. I think that students were going not because they necessarily believed what the Warrens were going to show them, but they wanted to see what they had to show, right? They wanted to decide for themselves, do these tapes and videos hold any water or not?
Could you talk a bit about the Warrens' influence on the Amityville horror book and film?
Yeah, so the Amityville horror, based on a totally debunked a situation in Long Island, and normally as a religion professor, I don't say, well, demons aren't real, so this story can't be true. But in this case, we have a smoking gun, right? That the whole thing was concocted. So the Lutz family buys this large house. They buy it very cheaply because there was a gruesome mass murder that took place there. Ronnie DeFeo kills his family in this house, so they get it for cheap. And the official story is they stay there for 28 days, and it's so haunted that they leave, and it becomes known as the Amityville House. Later, it turns out that Ryan DeFeo's lawyer had been in basically a conspiracy with the family to write a horror story. And he said, I'm going to feed you information from this murder, and you can combine that with this sort of story that you're making up. And he drew up a contract. And then the Lutz family said, why don't we just cut this lawyer out? We've got everything we need from him. Let's just get our own writer, and so that's how the Amityville horror came to be written. Well, the lawyer said, you can't cut me out. I'm going to tell on you. So he airs the laundry about this scheme, but very few people know this about the Amityville horror story. And then I interviewed Jerry Solfin, who is a psychical researcher, so someone who was trying to seriously, scientifically study claims of the paranormal. And he said that the Lutz family would call him almost every day and say, can you come out and certify that my house in Long Island is haunted? And he said, well, we don't do that. We don't give certificates of haunting or anything like that.
Oh, gosh.
And so finally he came out, and when he got there, the Warrens showed up, and there was this huge news crew there.
Ah.
And someone from the news had sort of seen the story was beginning to get some traction, and called out the Warrens and said, "Why don't you come out and do a séance?" So Lorraine Warren does a séance and says, "Yeah, this is a very dangerous place. It's the most evil place ever. There's a portal to hell. This kind of stuff." Jerry Sullivan refuses to participate in the séance, and then the Warrens left. So as far as I can tell, they were only actually ever in the Amityville Horror House for maybe an hour or two. Jerry Sullivan then spent the night in the house, really because he didn't want to get back on the road. It was late at night, and said there's just absolutely nothing special about this. How there's nothing for me to investigate as someone who investigates claims of paranormal phenomenon. But as the Warrens' career went on, they kept saying we were at Amityville, and finally they said we were the chief investigators in the Amityville horror case. And I think they spent the rest of their career sort of trying to make that happen a second time, trying to find another case they could insert themselves into that would get that kind of a claim.
And was this the first of their like big, high-profile cases that they did, Ed and Lorraine?
It's probably the most high profile case they were ever involved in. But they had, a series of books that were all, written by other people that then became the basis for the various films in the Conjuring franchise. So there was, this household called the Smurls, where there was a kind of media a circus around hauntings there. There was this case in Connecticut where there was actually a murder, and the Warrens tried to say this person should be found not guilty by reason of demonic possession. That was the
Mm.
basis of the Conjuring 3. So they had quite a lot of cases over the years, but some of them sort of had an X factor where they could maybe get someone to make a book out of it.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting point just with that sort of Conjuring 3 point, which we get with some of these films, especially the sort of, I guess, the second wave or the ones that have come after these foundational titles, is that they often side with, I guess the dubious account. And sometimes this is ethically murky. Like I think in The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which is based on a real incident that happened in Germany of a young girl who, I think there was something like 79 exorcism rituals, and she ends up dying. And it's basically a case of sort of abuse and negligence, but believed by the people engaged that it was a legitimate, demonic possession and ritual to free her. And then in the film version, which moves it to America and does all this kind of thing, it essentially sides with the notion that it was demons, that demons are real. And with the Warrens in the Conjuring films, it basically says they're right every time, that the demons are real. And when you lean into it based on a true story, you are taking an interesting side. Now, I'm not too sure about the Warrens personally. Do you think these people were knowingly hucksters? Were they taking people for a ride? Or do we see the Warrens as people who really believe what they're saying? They're kind of ancient mystics who happen to be born in the 20th century? Or are they really just the scamming the gullible?
Our investigation of the Warrens was interesting. We didn't want to just repackage information that was already there. We wanted to find something new, and we did. We found archival sources about the Warrens that hadn't really been examined before. And so one of the things we found that was really odd was a photo of Ed and Lorraine Warren leading a group of people dressed as witches, dressed as druids at night. And it said Ed and Lorraine Warren leading a witch ceremony. And I said, "What? They can't lead a witch ceremony. These are demon fighters, right? That goes against everything that they stand for." And their very first book actually was extremely sympathetic to Wicca, to neo-paganism, and said, these people figured out that they could activate their psychic abilities through doing these rituals, and the church didn't understand it, and the church cracked down on it. And then Jerry Sulfan, who I mentioned, who knew the Warrens going back to the 70s, and actually spoke kindly of them. He didn't say that they were bad people. He just said he disagreed about their conclusions. But he said, "Yeah, I think Ed Warren identified as a witch for a while." And I said, "Really?" And I actually called him back. I said, "I'm just going through my notes. You said Ed Warren identified as a witch for a while." And he said, "Yeah." And so what I think happened with the Warrens is, first of all, they were primarily artists. That was their real interest, was sort of trying to
Mm.
make a vocation out of being artists. And I think they were interested in kind of a wide array of supernatural ideas and phenomenon. But after The Exorcist came out, that was where they found their brand. As they said, "That's it. We are demon busters. We're Catholic demon busters." And if you were in that cultural moment where everybody wanted an exorcism from the Catholic Church and couldn't get one, you could always go to the Warrens. The Warrens were these kind of backroom exorcism brokers. They would find you somebody to do your exorcism, even if it wasn't done through the proper Catholic channels. So I think they certainly began as true believers. But I also talked to two people who worked with them, and independently, they both said the same thing. Of they went to Ed Warren and they said, "Look, I'm supposed to be writing a book about this case. The stuff that you're saying is not the same stuff that the family is saying, and the family stories don't add up with each other either. So I don't know what I'm supposed to write about because this isn't coherent at all." And Ed Warren took him aside and said, "Look, everybody here is crazy or they wouldn't have called us. Right? You're a horror writer.
Mm.
Just write something and make it scary." And then independently, I talked to someone who was researching with Ed Warren on the show Sightings, a haunted house. And he said that he could see people were just faking evidence. That, for example, he saw a rock roll off the roof of the house. And then Ed Warren walked around from the other side of the house, and he said, "Are you just throwing rocks on the roof while we're investigating?" And he said, "This isn't a serious investigation." And Ed Warren said, "Look, everybody here is crazy, or they wouldn't have ever called us. Right? Just
Okay.
play along, just go with it." So I think that they probably began as true believers, and maybe they always were true believers, but I do think that they were not above faking evidence by the end of their career. And this is partly that it's hard to make a career out of being a paranormal investigator, especially in an age before podcasting and YouTube and things like this.
Yeah, and I suppose there's not necessarily always a contradiction between being a true believer and faking evidence. You can believe that you have to tell the lie for the greater good, or a lie that reveals a truth. Milo was making like a little short film at the moment based on a few trips to churches in Italy where on a specific day of the year at a specific time the Marian statues will reliably cry blood, and this happens every year, and we're just and the film sort of imagines the monk who's torn up about the idea, about having to go through with this lie and doing the piping or whatever, but still it being a gesture of faith ultimately, of of reasserting the faith through non-faithful means.
That's
I'm
right. You
convinced. I'm convinced a better film about the Warrens could be made than The Conjuring if it's the real Warren. This guy sounds interesting. I found it in The Conjuring, the character's pretty straight-faced superhero, but yeah, the guy who's sort of faking evidence, they're all nuts anyway. What's real, what isn't? I think that's compelling.
Well, a lot of people said that Ed Warren had anger issues, and this was why he couldn't really hold down a serious job. And he was in the Pacific Front during World War II. He was in a shipwreck.
Mm.
And I think he probably had PTSD and was of a generation where that was never diagnosed and treated, which isn't an excuse for everything that, people have criticized him for. But I do think that, if you have someone who was in a battleship that was sunk in World War II and they sometimes fly off the handle and get a little angry, I think it's pretty easy to see why that might be the case.
Mm. Alongside the Warrens, another person who was extremely influenced by The Exorcist and found a sort of new raison d'etre through it was Malachi Martin. Maybe not as well known as the Warrens. Could you just tell us, like, who is Malachi Martin? What effect did The Exorcist have on him?
Right. It's a complicated question
Yeah, yeah.
because who is Malachi Martin is very contested, but he was a Jesuit priest. So again, this is the order that performed this exorcism that the Exorcist story is based on. And he was in Rome, so he was very involved in Vatican II when the Catholic Church was sort of reforming its rituals, and he taught languages there and so forth. But he was essentially kicked out, and there's some contestation about why he was kicked out. But what seems to be the case is that he basically seduced a journalist's wife and was asked to leave. That's not how Malachi Martin will tell it, but that seems to be what happened. He ended up in New York City, so he goes from having this kind of very glamorous position in Rome to being a cab driver or working at a donut shop and so forth. And The Exorcist is really big. And so he says, "Well, look, I'm a Catholic priest. I'm gonna write a better story about exorcism." And so in 1976, he writes this book called Hostage to the Devil. This was a very compelling book about, so supposedly real cases of exorcism. I think if you read Hostage to the Devil with even a tiny iota of skepticism, it immediately becomes clear that all of this is made up, right? None of this could have possibly ever happened. I mean, even if you really believe in demons, it's saying things like, "Oh, and then there was a satanic orgy with 200 people, and they had a cold buffet." I just love the image of these Satanists, having, olives and things before they begin their satanic orgy. Or universities researching people who can use their psychic powers to levitate and things like this. But never doesn't matter. The book becomes a bestseller. It's excoriated by William Peter Blatty, who says this is badly researched. Like you don't know anything about demonology or exorcism. But because he was just making all of this up, he says, well, here's how you do an exorcism, and there's always these 6 steps that you have to go through. And
Mm.
so this was kind of the closest thing to like a how-to manual for Catholic exorcism, even though it was totally made up by this basically fired a priest. And so it has had a very enduring influence on exorcism and horror movies to this day.
Mm. Has it had an influence on the actual Catholic practice of exorcisms?
Yes, it has. And so something that network television in America had pursued for a long time was to do a live exorcism on TV. And the Catholics who were doing exorcisms always said, absolutely not, right? That would be wildly unethical. And finally, in the late 90s, they found a family in Florida who were willing to do this. They were going to get an exorcism for their 15-year-old daughter, and they invited the network TV to come in and film this exorcism live. And they played the music from The Omen, while they're doing this. And it's deeply disturbing because they don't seem to tell this 15-year-old girl that they're going to do this. And she says, "What have I done wrong? What's happening?" And the priest says, "Oh, you haven't done anything wrong." Right? It's the demon. But when she starts, thrashing and doing everything she's expected to do, you can hear the priest doing this say, "Aha, this is the clash phase." Well, that's one of those phases that was made up by Malachi Martin in 1976. There is nothing prior to 1976 in any Catholic source that talks about things like that. So it's very clear that the Catholic exorcists were reading this fake book and saying, "Okay, this is what I ought to be doing. I ought to be following the steps in this book." I find that deeply problematic, right? That this book that was basically written by this kind of psychopath guy to make a buck then becomes the basis on which actual people are being exercised.
And it's interesting you see just the exorcist itself, the exorcism depicted in that film, in so many ways has become just the exorcism that exists. Recently, one of the films I saw preparation for this was The Pope's Exorcist, which you could almost call as kind of like a wacky superhero remake of The Exorcist. But it's just fascinating how play for play, all these things that are sort of innovated for The Exorcist are now just the normal signs of exorcism. Writing on the skin, you're strapped down on the bed, some levitation at some point, potty mouth, kind of overtly sexual dialogue from the child, which in The Exorcist makes a lot of sense because this is a child who's probably been sexually abused. In The Pope's Exorcist, it's just copying the copy of the copy. But it's interesting just how quickly, and this is a film from the 70s that now is still beat for beat being replicated in what isn't a remake. And something else I'm curious about is how Europe, I suppose, reacted to what was going on in America and the wider Catholic world. When this exorcism was brought up, were there still places in Europe where exorcism was practiced? Were they thinking, well, that's not how it's done? Was this a sort of global resurgence of a long dead practice or rite?
So in the Catholic Church, you were supposed to do an exorcism according to the Ritual Romanum, which is sort of the official rituals of the Catholic Church. And it's very specific. You have to do it this way. You have to look for these signs. You have to have the permission of your bishop to do this. Now, there are loopholes to this. So if a priest really wants to give you an exorcism, you might say, "Well, we're not going to do the official solemn rite of exorcism. We're just going to do some kind of lesser jury-rigged prayer, and if someone calls me out on it, I'll say I didn't break the rules." When The Exorcist came out, it was a huge effect in the United States. Um, in Europe, it did not get the same reaction. So West Germany, for example, it didn't really get much of a reaction at all from that country. And then you mentioned Father Gabriel Amorth, who's obviously Italian. He was involved in an order of priests that dealt with popular culture in the media, and he said The Exorcist was his favorite film. And then he even said, "I'm only able to bring back Catholic exorcism because of this movie, because of horror movies. That is what has allowed me to lobby the Catholic Church." He formed a group called the International Association of Exorcists and bring back exorcism. So it's hardly surprising that he is emulating this film. And then you have evangelical exorcists like Bob Larson. Bob Larson in the United States will rent out a hotel ballroom and just exorcise anybody in the ballroom who wants thinks they have a demon. But when he does this, he wears a priest collar and he wields this big wooden cross. And other evangelicals have said, "Why are you doing that? That is nonsense Catholic stuff." And he kind of makes excuses, but I think it's pretty obvious he's cosplaying as Father Marin from The Exorcist.
I think it's really interesting that now, probably from what we were talking to Sean McLeod about, the deliverance ministries of the evangelical church probably outnumber exorcisms by quite a lot because they seem to be pretty, lackadaisical about handing those out. And you don't need to appeal to a higher authority. There's no Vatican even vaguely regulating it. And yet in cinema, it's still, as far as I can tell, is an almost completely Catholic idea. If you want to get rid of a demon, it's got to be with the Catholics. And this is, this is being played to a mostly Protestant or non-dom or non-religious audience. Why is it that the Catholics, despite these new evangelical practices with millions and millions of followers, why is it the Catholics have this locked down absolutely?
Right. Well, the deliverance minister's argument is in the Bible, there is no ritual that Jesus and the apostles simply command demons to leave in the name of Jesus and then they leave, which is fine theologically, but cinematically, that's terrible, right? Nobody wants to watch a movie where someone just says, "Get out of here, name of Jesus," right? So it's hard to depict. So people like, I think, this the kind of ritualistic elements, and that what they really want to see is a struggle, right? They want to see a struggle between the will of the exorcist and the will of the demon. And this is something that Malachi Martin was criticized about. He said, there's always this conflict of wills between, the warrior priest exorcist and the demon. And Catholic theologians said, no, there isn't. It's God is doing the exorcism, right? That the priest is simply asking for divine intervention. That the priest isn't really that important in all of this. What's important is doing the ritual and calling on the power of the church. So people want to see that, and it's hard to depict a kind of deliverance ministry in a way that is cinematic and impressive. One interesting counterexample, there was an Catholic exorcism in 2012 in Gary, Indiana, and that was recently made into a movie that I think is just called The Deliverance. And in that case, you have this very poor black family who ends up getting a Catholic priest to exorcise them. And in the movie version, I think they said that's not really a great story of some white Catholic priest coming in and saving this family. And so they have a Pentecostal style exorcism with speaking in tongues and things like this. So they deviate from the actual story, but I think it was an attempt to really show an exorcism movie using Pentecostal and evangelical forms of deliverance.
I think a good clash is in The Omen, where the family, this kind of rich ambassadorial family, they're Episcopalians, but the big info comes from the Catholic priest who arrives, as though these kind of upright Protestants, their ears aren't tinged to the demonic noise. They can't hear it when they go to church, even though the Episcopal Church is sufficient to send, the demon child into mania. It has to come from this Irish-ish sounding priest who has the real information. And the Omen in general is another interesting one for the survival of certain elements. Something that surprised me watching it is that 666 isn't known to people as obviously the number of the beast. They sort of have to get into pretty esoteric, oh, the book of Revelation and this poem. Whereas now you walk out into the street, ask anyone 666, they'll say, oh, you mean the number of the beast? And was it the case that when The Omen came out, people simply didn't know this? And that now, since that and Iron Maiden and so many other things, it has latched onto very normal public consciousness.
Yeah, so amongst biblical scholars, it's pretty much accepted. 666 refers to the Emperor Nero, right? It's not a mystery at all. It clearly refers to the Emperor Nero. And this is using something called gematria, where you can basically assign a number to a letter. And why would you refer to the Emperor Nero by a number? Well, because he's the Emperor of Rome, and if you're saying bad things about him, he will have you crucified, right? So it's no real mystery. But yeah, as far as we can tell, there was not a lot of preoccupation with the number 666. And of course, in The Exorcist, it is the most ham-fisted way imaginable, where it's literally he has a birthmark with the number
Yeah.
666 under his hair. I mean, even the most kind of wild conspiracy theorists today would think it's a little bit more subtle than that. But Ronald Reagan purchased a house, and the address was 666, and he had it changed because he didn't want people to know that his address had three sixes in it. Here, growing up in Texas, I remember being in chemistry class and doing calculations for a chemistry formula. And the chemistry teacher, who's supposed to teach about science, not letting us write 0.666 when that was
Ah.
the outcome of a chemical equation. So it's really deep in the consciousness now that just these three numbers are sort of the worst thing you could ever come across.
It always bothered me that it was 1976 that Damien's born. It's like the 6th of June, good so far. And then they didn't wait till 2006, although I think it was remade in 2006.
There was a
Um,
2000, yeah, a remake
came
with Mia
out.
Farrow actually from
Yeah,
Rosemary's Baby in it.
yeah, yeah. Um, in the Omen, we get this overlap between the demonic and the world of politics. It's agreed that the Sea of Tranquility in the Book of Revelation definitely refers to the world of politics. For some reason, at the end, the president agrees to adopt a random ambassador's son, and that's the devil's way into the seat of power. Could you talk about some of the ways that, especially in films like Rosemary's Baby, the fear of the elites and the fear of the satanic is sort of influenced by films in American sort of popular consciousness?
Sure. I mean, the idea that the Antichrist will be some sort of powerful religious or secular leader, that's a very old idea, right? And that is what Revelation is actually talking about, right? The Emperor of Rome is this evil enemy of the church. So throughout history, Christians have pointed to different figures and said, aha, this is the Antichrist, that's the Antichrist. That has only accelerated in the late 20th century. Prior to Rosemary's Baby, as we mentioned, there weren't really many depictions of Satanists in film. And if there were, they were sort of seen as like very creepy weirdos. So if you watch The Black Cat is actually, I think, an influence on the Rocky Horror Picture Show, where you have
Yeah, yeah.
newlyweds and they're stuck in this crazy castle and everybody's a weirdo and worships Satan. So what was innovative about Rosemary's Baby is it actually is the seemingly kind of pillars of the community. It's the doctors, the educated class. All of these people are secretly Satanists. So that kind of paranoid element has gotten worse and worse. And so now we are accusing, of course, Democratic presidents and candidates of being Satanists, but also figures like Tom Hanks. I still don't totally understand how QAnon began claiming that Tom Hanks was drinking a children's blood, but that paranoia, I think you can see forming in Rosemary's Baby.
And what are some of uh no, sorry, I'll hand over to Milo. I like
Yeah,
half thought.
yeah. So we have these sort of the elites in America or the elite class who are implicated, and I find there's a curious cure in a few of these films. It's not quite across the board, but you get it in The Exorcist and you get it in The Omen, which is traveling to distant eastern lands where a Western Orientalist holds some kind of exotic and esoteric knowledge of both sort of Christian and otherwise demons and can solve certain problems. The prologue of The Exorcist, I think, is fascinating. My favorite part of the film. It's like it's a completely different movie, absurdly beautiful photography, and then the curious moment of discovering this sort of artifact of the demon, whoever it may be, but also discovering that little coin, the St. Joseph's totem, somehow in this, I guess, Babylonian or Mesopotamian dig site. And you do get these sort of totems throughout this genre of film. But what is the fascination with the Orientalists? I mean, it reminds me of things like The Mummy, going into ancient tombs, breaking old seals, and something about imperial proliferation going back and forth.
Yeah, so I mean, at the most basic level, this is where Christianity begins, right? In the Middle East, and I think if you look at the history of America, they've always had this weird sort of inferiority complex about this because many Americans believe we're part of God's plan. We're a nation chosen by God. How come Jesus didn't live in North America, right?
Mm.
And so of course the Latter-day Saints Church said, well, he did actually, right? That was, I think, part of their big appeal. So Americans, and to this day, I think this shapes, America's relationship with Israel and things like this. It's this kind of it's a country that often conceives of itself as a Christian nation, even legally it is not. with kind of the birthplace of Christianity. And then William Peter Blatty, he was Lebanese by heritage. His mother was an immigrant from Lebanon. He spoke Arabic. And so, as I mentioned, he worked for the Foreign Service. So he maybe was perhaps justified in having this element of his story. Warner Brothers told William Friedkin, please, please do not go to Iraq to film something. We have deserts here in America if you need a desert. William Friedkin did anyways. And they made this giant statue of Pazuzu that actually got lost and sent to Hong Kong by accident. Imagine,
what a thing for a Chinese random delivery guy to find.
right? So this cargo plane comes. There's one crate left in it. It's not supposed to be there, and you open it, and that's what you see. He wanted in that shot with where you see Pazuzu to have hawks circling it because hawks are a symbol of war, and he had this hawk master come out from England, and the hawks were not having this. It was 106 degrees or something, and they just wouldn't fly. And so he had to get, stray dogs or something like that instead. But because it is such a great scene, I think it's almost required now that if you're going to do an exorcism movie, you have to have demons sort of coming out of the Middle East or being unearthed from the Middle East. There was a very bad movie called Deliver Us from Evil. It was based on the accounts of a New York police sergeant who actually was a student of Malachi Martin and very problematically saw his work in law enforcement as being combating demons. But that also begins with American soldiers coming home from Iraq and opening a tomb or something like that and letting out a demon. And in post-colonial theory, which is very popular right now in universities, some people have said, this is actually a really problematic way to start your exorcism movie, right? This is reinserting this idea of, the West is white and scientific and good, and the Middle East is basically, outside of time, and that's where demons and things trying to kill us originate. That's maybe not a very healthy way to think about the world.
This was something I thought The Pope's Exorcist, while it is not a film of much quality, it innovates it a little bit by finding the original sin, the demonic source, within Europe itself. It has this interesting conceit where there was a sort of grand exorcist of years gone by who was himself demonically possessed, and he was then responsible for the Spanish Inquisition, which is a wonderful way of kind of sort of forgives the Catholic Church, but also says the Catholic Church was led by a literal demon for decades, persecuting people in Iberia. But it's sort of a twist on the idea. It's still the distant past. It's still sort of tombs and skeletons and old priests, but it finds it within Catholicism or within Europe rather than traveling out, into the exotic East.
Yeah, I mean, I thought The Pope's Exorcist was an utterly bizarre film, but especially in the third act where it becomes like Indiana Jones all of a sudden, and they're in this subterranean temple and there's fireballs shooting at them and stuff like this, and they clearly set it up at the end where this could be many, many sequels, right? If they have to go all over the world and
199 sequels. I'd like to express right. They set up 199 sequels.
And of course, it does let the church off the hook. But on the other hand, they could have made a movie where they simply never talked about any of these bad things the church did. So they mention the Spanish Inquisition, and they also have this woman who commits suicide because she says, I'm being molested by the church. And Gabriel Amorth does not believe her and blames himself for her suicide. So they could have left those elements out completely. So there is a little bit of acknowledgement that the church is not always in the right, which is maybe surprising considering it's a film like this.
Yeah, it's very hard not to have the abuse stuff in your head in the final moment of The Exorcist where Reagan kisses the priest. At least for me. The Exorcist maybe in this post-Catholic abuse scandal aged all of the abuse themes in it come more to the forefront than it might have done for the original audience. And and on top of that, now we know that like Malachi Martin, there were certainly quite a lot of sex abuse scandals with him. I think there have been some accusations with Ed Warren as well, that lots of the people who are most interested in sort of yeah, purifying the youth, or like uncovering a cadre of satanic ritual abusers or whatever it might be themselves are guilty in some respect or another, which you can plant onto the entire Catholic Church for several decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's there was an exorcist who made a YouTube video about me and my work, and basically saying that I'm probably a Satanist and certainly don't know anything about exorcism. And he said, in fact, there were exorcisms before there were horror movies, so as if that was supposed to be some kind of big revelation to me. But this priest was recently charged with a sexual assault. And apparently, what happened was he was working with some Catholic youth, and there was this young woman, and she had very long hair, and he said, "Your hair is really long. Do you ever floss your teeth with it?" And put a strand of her hair in his mouth. And then it was debated, did he actually put it in the mouth or not? And eventually the charges are dropped. Her father was very upset when he heard this priest grabbed his daughter's hair in this way. Whether or not this priest meant anything salacious by doing this, I think it's significant that this shows a pretty serious lack of judgment. I was a high school teacher. I would never touch a student's hair like that. And I do find it significant that a lot of the priests who become really invested in exorcism tend to have a kind of lack of judgment that seems to also get them involved in sex scandals and things like this. So I do think that that is kind of a common a phenomenon. The other thing I'd like to add about the priest getting a kiss from Reagan at the end of the film, it's sometimes easy to forget that before the kind of Catholic sex abuse scandal came to the fore in 2001, people had these very strange relationships with priests because they were seen to be really not like normal people. So
Mm.
with one of the priests who was a predator in Boston, you hear these stories like, well, he would come over every weekend to bathe my children. He'd just come over to the house and he would strip my children naked and put them in the bathtub. And I never thought anything inappropriate was happening. And it's
Yeah, yeah.
unimaginable today, right, that anyone would allow someone who was an immediate member of the family to bathe your children. But that was the attitude in a lot of these communities: is a priest really can do no wrong and is to be trusted no matter what. So when they have Reagan kissing a priest, I think they just figured that's
Yeah.
not a controversial thing at all.
Yeah, and she sees the collar as well, because she's this is the post-possession Reagan at the end of the film. She's been freed. She knows a priest is responsible for freeing her. It zooms in on the collar, not the actual man above it, and then she kisses the cheek. Yeah, it's done like that. Have you had any other significant sort of pushback against you about the work you're doing? Because you've appeared in quite a few people's YouTube videos discussing Satanism and various other you know, kind of spicy topics.
Yeah, I have actually. So I mentioned this reaction video that was, and in the video, they have a picture of me and they put like red pentagrams like swirling around my face and stuff like this, and they have a cartoon bubble coming out of my mouth that says demons obviously don't exist. And then they asked me if I would do a debate on their YouTube channel, and I said, well, you literally put words in my mouth, right? If you take down this image you made of me with pentagrams attacking me and this news bubble, then we can talk about it. And they kind of never got back to me on that. So yeah, there was that, and then I've written on this group called the Satanic Temple, and I'll occasionally get hate mail related to writing about the Satanic Temple, and the attitude seems to be, you didn't explicitly say that these are horrible people, so therefore you're if you're not with us, then you're with them. And then there was a lawsuit with Newsweek, between the Satanic Temple and Newsweek, for this really kind of salacious headline that they made about them. And in discovery in that lawsuit, we found that this Catholic journalist said, there's this professor named Joseph Laycock, and he is really soft selling all this stuff. And if we could, get him in this Newsweek article somehow, that would be. So I thought, wow, there are there are people, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean there aren't people out to get you. When I saw that. So, but as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, I talked about the so-called cult wars. And so this goes with the territory. If you write research on kind of ephemeral or minority religions, you will often get accused of being sort of a cult apologist or someone who is on the side of these marginalized groups. I don't think of myself as being on anybody's side, but this, some of this is bound to happen.
Your
A
book.
nice inversion, just to the narratives you see in these films, where it's kind of the demons are closing in on the innocent Christian family, whereas here it's the anti-demonics who are closing in on the innocent academic just trying to research their ways.
Well, it's always that way, right? Because these people say, well, Satanists they kill children in satanic rituals, and they get away with it because the police cover it up. I'm aware of children being killed in rituals, and those rituals are always exorcisms. All right, there's always someone does an exorcism of a child and they kill it. And recently, there was a case. I think it was in San Diego. Someone killed, I think, a 5-year-old, and they were trying to defend the murder of this 5-year-old on religious freedom grounds and saying, well, if you persecute us for killing our child in an exorcism, that goes against our religious beliefs. This is never going to get any traction in the court. But again, it's this profound projection, right? You are the people killing your children, and you're accusing some kind of imaginary conspiracy of doing the exact same thing.
Your book.
Shockingly, that is good. Oh no, you
Yeah,
take
yeah,
it. Take it away.
it expands on an earlier one called American Exorcism by a guy called I think is Michael Cuneo. Is that how you pronounce it? Which covers kind of a lot of the same ground. Could you talk a bit about some of the ways you like diverged from Cuneo's book, and do you have any like major disagreements with it that made you write yours?
No, I think Cuneo's book was a huge influence on me, right? Particularly because he calls out the Warrens and Malachi Martin. So I was really trying to kind of build on that book, and I was trying to build on it both theoretically by kind of getting some actual kind of sociological and psychological studies to kind of back up how this kind of transference from horror to religion could work, but also try to get more archival data, right? So I really kind of a lot of this book was sort of building on insights that were already there from Cuneo.
Yeah. Could we have a brief discussion of lizard people? Do you have time? I know you're doing lizard people stuff at the
Yeah,
moment.
I don't know how long I'm supposed to go for.
Yeah, well,
Can
I mean,
you give me just a second here?
we could give you a break if you need one, or we could stop. We don't need lizard people. This is a purely optional.
Yeah, do you mind?
On the
No,
phone with the
we're
lizard
good. We're
people.
good.
It's
Sorry.
okay.
We're fine. I was getting a text from my wife, but it's okay. Yeah, we can talk about lizard people. Sure. Wife's
I, ca-
busy. I can talk about lizard people.
I came I came home from from university. I think it was during my second year, and my dad would start dropping like interesting little comments in otherwise normal conversations, like the Queen is a lizard, or indeed Tom Hanks is a lizard. Where did the lizard people come from, Joe? What's the origin of this?
Well, I'm a bit prejudiced, but I think it came from my home state of Texas in 1929 with a pulp writer named Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard created Conan the Barbarian, who people may have heard of. And in 1929, he wrote a story called The Shadow Kingdom, where one of his warrior characters inherits this kingdom, and he finds out that it's really ruled by this ancient race of shape-shifting serpent men who can take the form of other people, and they sort of rule the kingdom by proxy. And so that story it did very well in the pulp market in 1929. It's been called the first true fantasy story because it's all set in an imaginary a realm. And then during the Great Depression, someone started an organization called the Brotherhood of the White Temple, and it was one of these mail order occult groups. So you send away a check, and then you start getting instructions about kind of secret a lost lore from Egypt and Tibet and so forth. And so, what do you actually get? Well, it seems that this person was simply reading Pulp Fiction and taking ideas from these Pulp Fiction stories and then just saying it's all real. So he starts to say that there used to be serpent men from Atlantis who could shapeshift and who ruled the world thousands of years ago. And then we get UFOs, and now the lizard people come into UFOs. And then in the 80s, we have a television show called V, which was very popular in America, where these aliens come and they seem benevolent, but they actually are reptilian and they're wearing rubber suits and they set up a fascist government. And then finally, after all of this, we have David Icke in the UK, and David Icke is sort of like he did for this conspiracy theory what Paul the Apostle did for Christianity. Right? He takes it and he makes it into this absolute phenomenon that everybody becomes deeply invested in.
Yeah, there's also Doctor Who. Me and Maya was there's the Silurians, I believe, in Doctor Who are a reptilian sort of species that live under the earth. I don't know whether this was like the specific influence on Ike, or do you know that Ike was influenced by this Conan guy?
Yeah, so no, I think Ike didn't know about the Brotherhood of the White Temple or Robert E. Howard until he had been talking about lizard people for some time. But there were the lizard people. It sort of goes into this sort of deep milieu of like UFO conspiracy theories, where David Icke eventually discovers it and popularizes it. But also to your point, this idea of the Shadow Kingdom, it gets reflected in all of these weird sort of pop culture things. So I mentioned V. You have Doctor Who with the Silurians. Here in the States, there was a Saturday morning show called Land of the Lost with these creatures called the Sleestaks.
Okay.
And so what this means is that when David Icke comes along and says, there's this ancient race of reptilian creatures, on some level, everybody kind of
Yeah,
knew that
that
was true
sounds
already.
familiar. That sounds.
They've been seeing this their whole lives, even if they hadn't noticed it.
And how does that build into the whole hollow earth notion? It goes nicely with it because, well, where do they live? The earth is hollow.
Right.
There it is. But is that a separate development? Is this some kind of ancient Aristotelian notion of the earth? Or was it invented solely to give the lizard men a subterranean home?
Yeah, so the hollow earth is an old idea. It goes back to the 1800s. There was a guy in the States in the 1800s who theorized that the North and South Pole are entrances into this hollow earth. And of course, he wanted the United States to go there and colonize it and take all of its resources. And he toured America trying to get a campaign to go do this. And when that didn't work, he wrote a fictional novel about this guy who goes and colonizes the hollow earth and claims all of its
Yeah,
resources
I've
for
actually
America.
read it. It's all in caps lock.
Yeah. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story dealing with the hollow
Yes.
earth.
Yeah, the
Um,
end of his novel. It's an amazing ending as well because it cuts at the moment that we go into the Hollow Earth.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned the Brotherhood of the White Temple. If you ask them, where did you get all this information? They'd say, well, I went to Tibet, and there's this super elevator in Tibet that goes deep down into the earth. And there's,
Ah.
that's where the Brotherhood of the White Temple meets and so forth. So it's a very old idea. And at some point, people began asking, well, where do these reptilian beings come from? And that is one of the answers, right? They survived within the hollow earth. And going back to even things like Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote the Tarzan novels, he wrote a novel where people go inside the earth, and of course, it's full of dinosaurs, and it's ruled by these pterodactyl-like creatures with hypnotic powers. And it sounds a lot like the reptilians, and that's at the end of the 1800s.
Jules Verne as well, of course.
Hmm.
Yeah. And what do you think the lizard people offer people as an explanation for reality? Why lizards? Why is this such a compelling story to people?
Yeah, I think at the most basic level, so in religious studies, there is this term theodicy, which is basically, why is there suffering in the world, right? So to me, I think the lizard people is about theodicy. It is taking all of the suffering that's going on in the world, and it's telling you, well, there's one simple cause for all of this, and it's lizard people, and not just sort of crashing economies and fomenting wars and other kinds of things, but there is someone who says, I fell in love with this girl in high school and she never loved me back, and now I know the lizard people did that to me, right? Because the lizard people feed on just sort of the energy of human suffering. And he even said lizard people can make you gay, right? Lizard people can change your sexual orientation, not because being gay is bad, but because the lizard people know we're in a homophobic society. And so gay people will suffer more. So by turning you gay, they get more
Mm.
negative energy. Or people have said my son got addicted to meth because of the lizard people. So it's literally everything bad that's happening has one source, and we're not responsible for any of it. Right? Any human being that does truly terrible things isn't actually a human being at all. So we're actually this wonderful species, and we're about to have this wonderful new world once we can finally root out and kill all of the lizard people.
Yeah,
The
and
problem with this is nothing good has ever happened in history by saying a certain group of people are not really people and we just have to hunt them down.
yeah, I suppose one of the things that lizard people offers to our sort of post Holocaust sensibilities is the ability to blame all the problems of the world on a specific group of people without specifying a specific ethnicity or race or cultural background. Because the lizard people, they shapeshift. They're all sorts of people. The lizard people are an international cadre who are everywhere, and lots of these lizard people tropes overlap pretty much one to one with classic anti-Semitic tropes. Whereas in lizard people sort of theodicy, you get to maintain these brotherhood of man notions, these human equality, human rights, post World War II humanistic notions, while also maintaining this explanation for all of human misery.
That's right, and I think the anti-Semitism is really baked in. So Robert E. Howard's letters to H.P. Lovecraft about the Jews are pretty terrible, pretty hard to defend. He did at least say during the Nazi regime, "This is terrible. These Nazis are killing innocent people. They're being barbaric." Which is ironic because Howard always said, "I love barbarians." Right? Barbarians
Yeah.
are great, but apparently not when you're killing innocent people. And then the I mentioned the Brotherhood of the White Temple. They're not perhaps explicitly anti-Semitic, but they did at one point subscribe to this notion that Jesus was not Jewish and was, an Aryan or something like this. And then as we get into David Icke, I think part of the genius in a way of David Icke was he had on the one hand sort of very left-wing people who said, "Oh, all the pollution and the corporate greed, that's all really the lizard people." And then on the other hand, he had straight up neo-Nazis. I mean, groups like Combat 18, these really bad groups who were saying, "Oh, this is brilliant. We just call them lizard people." And now he can say in public what we've been saying for years. And there was a really great documentary by John Ronson called "The Jews and the Lizards," which you can watch on YouTube. But he goes to this event in Canada where David Icke is scheduled to speak, and this coalition is trying to basically stop him from speaking and censor him. And it's really unclear, even amongst David Icke's own followers, of are we talking about literal lizard people from another planet, or is this a code word for Jews? So you're right that lizard people has become this kind of free floating signifier of whatever category of people you happen to be angry with and to be scapegoating.
Hmm.
And the tension is in the film They Live pretty broadly, because there's something very alluring about that film to the left wing, sort of anti-consumerism, anti-capitalist. You can finally see reality consume and so on. But then also for the anti-Semite, it's nectar. They live among us. You can't recognize them, but certain members of the Hollywood elite are of this other group, and with the glasses you can identify them. And then the solution is just mass murder.
That,
that
that,
that is how the film goes.
that's
And
right. Yeah, so John Carpenter actually explicitly came out and said this movie is about yuppies. It is not about Jews, and it's a slander for people to claim that it is because white supremacists were saying that. It's based on a 1967 short story called 8 o'clock in the Morning, where interestingly the aliens look like lizards in 1967. But in that
Mm.
story, it is unclear if any of this is really happening or if this is simply the story of a psychopathic mass murderer who's having hallucinations. So in 2020, a massive bomb went off in Nashville on Christmas morning, very early in the morning. This person converted his camper into a bomb, and he parked it in front of an AT&T facility, and he disrupted cell phone service in 3 states for a very long period of time by blowing up this AT&T facility. And he released a manifesto, and he said, "I'm fighting the lizard people. The lizard people are all around us, and there's a signal that prevents us from seeing them." And people thought, what's wrong with this person? Where would he get an idea like this? Well, I
Mm.
think it's straight out of the end of They Live. I think that was what he decided the solution was. If I can just blow up a big satellite like Rowdy Roddy Piper and They Live, I can finally save the world.
Yeah, another
A
one that's
movie's sending. Well, just so you first. You first.
I was just gonna another one that really fits into this quite nicely is Eyes Wide Shut. This one directed by a Jewish man, but where the people around you, the doctors, the senators, they're all meeting in the literal Rothschild mansion. I think Kubrick rented that specific mansion, and the lizard people discourse and the eyes wide shut discourse and Kubrick murder discourse and satanic child abusing elite discourse all overlap in a big circle. Yeah, and I don't know. I just wanted to bring that film up. Hand back to Milo.
Yeah, well, my comment jumps neatly off it, which is a simple question. A movie sending people insane. Did people used to have so many insane beliefs? Because we're seeing these things here, which have developed over just a few decades, basically, and now they're just familiar, everyday, pick them off the shelf beliefs. Yeah, lizard people and exorcisms. These are normal things that I encounter day to day. And 100 years ago, both would be what? Lizard exorcisms? So are we just very pliable to this relatively new media, which is and it's just we're losing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways we are. I've one of the things I've done in my research on lizard people is I've collected about 20 examples of murders and suicides and bombings from people who thought that they were fighting the lizard people, and so I've tried to think of, has anything like this happened before the era of modern mass media? And one case that I did look at was from Ireland in the late 1800s, where this person said, "My wife is a changeling," and set her on fire, the Bridget Cleary murders. So we've done this before. It's not like this is just because of movies, but these ideas are out there, and for certain people, especially if they are experiencing COVID lockdown and are just sort of doom scrolling all day long, or if they have some kind of mental health issue that is also affecting them, they may start to take these ideas in very literal ways. And I'm not really sure what the solution is. I don't think it's censorship. I don't think it's telling people what kinds of movies they can make. But I do wish that we did a better job in public education of sort of helping people think through really basic epistemology, right? How do we know what's real and what isn't? What are some basic tools? If we even taught school children things like the burden of proof is on the person making the claim, I think that could make a difference with some of these events.
I've not read
This could
much
be a
lizard people true believer stuff. Are there any really beautifully written lizard people tracts out there?
No, this is all pretty niche,
Damn.
right? I think David Icke is probably as eloquent as it gets for hearing about the history of the lizard people. But with things like YouTube and YouTube algorithms, if you click on a video about lizard people, well, then the next videos that YouTube suggests you will also be about lizard people. And in pretty short order, you can now be in an information ecosystem where everyone just takes the existence of lizard people for granted. right? No one is dissenting from this claim, and that's very dangerous. So I really think that the algorithms designed to kind of keep you engaged as long as possible for corporate profits are literally driving people crazy in some cases.
I think there could be a hope that, in terms of epistemology, that now the flood, and this is maybe an insane hope, but the flood of completely fabricated material generated by AI, while, we've lost the boomers and probably the millennials and Gen X, maybe the younger plastic minds will survive the barrage of falsehood and no longer take faith in anything, become kind of epistemological nihilists, and therefore kind of redeem themselves and be impossible to trick or indeed convince of any given fact. But yeah, we might get these kind of hyper cynics who emerge who do not, they're like iconoclasts. Any visual media, not real. Even if you just took the picture, that's pixels on a screen. So maybe we've just got to wait for the first generation of mass screen media has fallen. We have to accept they're gone. But maybe the children who grow up in these kind of prisons of falsehood they'll open their eyes and believe nothing again.
I mean, I've already seen photos on Twitter of this terrible war that was started for no reason with Iraq, or with Iran rather, and people are saying, this is fake, and in some cases they actually are, right? And you can find a little Gemini water stamp at the bottom of the photo. So
Six-fingered people.
that's right. So there is some of that skepticism has already begun. On the other hand, this morning I saw an article that people who think they have repressed memories of satanic ritual abuse, instead of seeing a proper therapist, are now going to ChatGPT and saying, "I think I may have been abused by Satanists as a child." And ChatGPT always says, "Well, then you were." Right? And they say, "I knew it." Right? I knew I was abused by Satanists. So I see this being really dangerous. And I have a file of people who call me sometimes. They call my office because they want an exorcism, or they think I can help them with demons in their house or something like this. And I've noticed that those have started to trail off starting around 2022, which was the year that ChatGPT went online. So I think that we are increasingly now having people who suspect there might be something paranormal happening, and they're going to AI, and AI is essentially confirming all of their wildest suspicions. So this is also going to lead to some really dangerous behavior, at least in the short run.
Are actual lizards in on the conspiracy, or is it just humanoid lizards?
Yeah, I haven't heard anyone. That's interesting, actually. I haven't heard anyone sort of blaming actual literal lizards. Although there was a very strange book called Transformation America, where this woman says I had repressed memories, and it turns out I was a sex slave to Ronald Reagan and Bob Hope and all these other sort of random collections of people. And she talks a lot about recovered memories of being in Mexico and seeing iguanas everywhere. So the iguanas start to be part of this, and then David Icke reads this, and he folds all of this into his kind of super conspiracy as well. So who knows? Maybe we'll be going after the iguanas at some point in the near future.
What do you think's going on with David Icke? Do you like what kind of man do you think he is in private? My instinct is like Pauline apostle, like he's locked in at all times. But I don't know. I wonder whether when the camera drops, if there is a certain drop. I don't know. What's your read on him psychologically?
I mean, it's hard to say, but I'm inclined to think that he really believes all of this, because he is well past the point where he needs to do this to earn a living. He is so prodigious in terms of cranking out all of these books. They're all very, very long books, and he always has to self-publish them now because he's been basically almost universally censored for saying things that, whether he thinks they're anti-Semitic or not, certainly come off as anti-Semitic. And he used to give these PowerPoint presentations that would last like 11 hours. Most people do not have the stamina to do that, let alone the inclination to do that.
Yeah,
So I
gosh.
don't think he's a scam artist. I think he truly believes all of this. As to sort of how he finds himself believing all of this, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think he evaluates claims very differently than normal people, and he also seems to be having these kinds of for lack of a better word, mystical experiences. He will do interviews and he'll say things like, I was laying in the bathtub and I saw this, purple energy floating around me in this eye, and I knew that it represented consciousness and so forth, right? As a religion scholar, I don't necessarily dismiss experiences like that as, mental illness. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not qualified to diagnose them, but most people don't have that kind of experience, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if nothing else, he is a special individual.
yeah. I'm curious, like, because so much of Ike seems like it's coming so directly from pop culture of his upbringing, of his youth, that's just he's taking things from pop culture around, talks about the Matrix a great deal, you know. I wonder whether the shame that the standard religion, the big eight religion believers might have in saying that some of their practices come from pop culture is maybe less there in people like David Icke, is maybe less there in people like the Satanic Temple. Are there instances in your studies where people unashamedly admit that our religious practices, no, they don't come from some ancient texts or traditions, they're just from some pop culture artifact?
Right. Well, first of all, David Icke says that all world religions were created by lizard people to enslave
Yeah.
us thousands of years ago. But there is also what are called fact fiction reversals. So David Icke would say, if you want to know the truth, you can't look at the news or a history book because that's all fake, but you can watch They Live because John Carpenter was in touch with the Hollywood elite, so he knows what's really going on. So fiction tells us what's really happening. Nominally true things do not. And then you can also have what are sometimes called invented religions. So the Satanic Temple is an example of an invented religion in that they just say, we made this up. And if you like what we made up, then you're welcome to join us. If you don't, then you're not. But we are not requiring you to believe in divine revelation or some ancient tradition that we claim has existed. We are simply making it up. And there are other examples of invented religions, Jediism, for example.
Hmm.
Simply as we watched Star Wars and we wanted to make a religion out of it. So that is a modern phenomenon. It may be kind of the only way to keep starting new religions in the 21st century when people are going to be skeptical of revelation or claims of some rediscovered ancient tradition.
And the place that folk tradition or sort of fairy tale might have taken in ancient Mesopotamia, in the places where the major world religions came from, is now taken by movies. It's taken by popular culture. The things that you dream about are often from pop culture, from movies, from TV, and the language with which we talk about reality is often filtered through popular culture. So it makes sense in a way that would apply to religious experience as well, even though it kind of feels a little bit embarrassing or a little bit strange to say, yes, that pop culture had a mystical or uh, supernatural effect on me or opened me up to the supernatural.
That's right, and I think that we assume if ancient people told stories about gods and heroes that they believed these things were literally true, right? And the way that we think, that current events are literally true. Well, the ancient Greeks, you can hike up to the top of Mount Olympus, right? It's a difficult hike, but you can do it. So I think probably that they regarded these stories actually surprisingly similarly to how we look at pop culture today, right? They are stories to think with, right? But they're not necessarily true in the same way that like current events or scientific knowledge are true. They're
I
true in their own
suppose
sense.
the difficulty comes in being hyper aware of the corporate origin of many of these stories, that they were made specifically to earn lots of money, often by indifferent makers. You have your sort of your great and tall art, but then you have whatever kind of superhero stuff that comes out, but it's nonetheless very meaningful, especially if you grew up with it. And and yeah, there's the tension between the sort of in folk stories and in these old tales. They were told for the sake of the telling, and there was some sort of a purpose in them. Whereas now it's so mixed up. And we have such a basically empirical or cynical view of the world. So we're no longer willing to say, well, maybe there was an Iron Man. We come into it thinking Iron Man does not exist, never existed, nothing about him is real, someone made him up. This is what we sign when we go into the cinema. But then to be moved by this figure or character, you have to feel a bit silly about it. Whereas if it's like the notion of Zeus, who may in some respect kind of exist, if he's not the bearded guy with the lightning bolt, there's something of him in the world is maybe a bit easier to acknowledge. But you end up tumbling back into the mass capitalism thing. You can see it's a machine. It says I'm the machine on front of it, but it's still in your dreams, and you have to figure out, why am I dreaming of machines?
Right. Yeah. I've mentioned Diana Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, but one thing that she discovered was that with the Conjuring movies, they did tremendous focus group research for every detail of that film to try to maximize engagement, right? Which is not how we normally make art, right? By sort of saying, well, what if we have this character say this? How does that make you feel? Or what if we do that? So yeah, this is problematic that we have kind of these corporate behemoths taking on this role that used to be part of mythology. And also the Conjuring franchise, they were very specific and they said we want to get churches to show this. We want to get penetration into religious spaces. Because there's a lot of money to be made there, so it's a deliberate attempt to kind of inject pop culture into the sphere of myth and religion.
Yeah, and these figures like Mel Gibson, or the vocally anti-Hollywood, and there's the anti-Semitic music in the statement, um, anti-Hollywood Hollywood that's going to be telling the gospel truth. That's sort of feels like it's waiting to become like really huge in America. There's the Passion of the Christ is still, I think, the highest grossing like explicitly Christian film in the States. Probably inflation adjusted, maybe something like The Exorcist would overtake it. But yeah, it is compelling to imagine a sort of a less secular Hollywood, a less bang for your buck Hollywood, and a more explicitly propagandistic, theocratic Hollywood. I'm not saying it's going to happen. It'd just be interesting, like the ways it would change and the ways it would remain the same.
When we have films like God's Not Dead, where Kevin Sorbo plays his philosophy professor who's requiring the students to sign a waiver saying they agree God is dead, and you have companies like PureFlix, which is a Christian version of Netflix. So it is a significant market space. It's not as big as Hollywood by any means, but there is a conscious effort, I think, to create something like a conservative Christian version of Hollywood.
I think to circle round back to a statement in your book, we have all of these sort of latter day horror films like The Conjuring, which very proudly were based on a true story. However flimsy that is, part of their reason to exist is the based on a true story put at the beginning and the pictures of the people at the end. And it's a sense of what you were mentioning earlier, also covered in The Exorcism of Emily Rose, that if you can prove evil exists, then goodness exists, then magic exists, then all of these, the world expands outwards. So it's a kind of re-enchantment to watch these films and be sort of convinced by them, or they kind of nudge you in the right direction. Maybe you end up believing in lizard people, but you're also believing in a lot more than previously did. Your scope is widening. So there is a sense of people wanting something, and they haven't got it in your traditional church setting necessarily, especially sort of in Europe. And they're not getting it in folk stories. But then there are these sort of spooky movies that are promising them a much bigger world. And I suppose it's easy enough to believe some of that stuff if it's given to you in this semi sort of based on a true story, documentary evidence way. Then maybe you think, well, the world is so small, let it be bigger.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and we know from research that there's a sleeper effect, right? So if you watch these things, you might leave saying, "Of course, that was just a movie," but over time, the idea kind of sits in your head, and so studies show that after watching these films, after a few weeks, a month, people are more likely to say things like, "Yes, I believe there is a devil," right? Or "Yes, I believe." in demons, which doesn't necessarily make them a Christian, but it does make them someone who has a higher index of supernatural beliefs.
Yeah. What are some of the main sort of little superstitious ticks, if any, that you have kept with you in life, Joe? My mum's also kind of like lapsed Catholic, and there's just certain things you're not allowed to do that just, you shouldn't. It's kind of, it would still be weird to put a cross very low in a room, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I've done ethnography with the Satanic Temple. These people have a lot of religious trauma, and that expresses in their rituals as blasphemy. Right? They like to blaspheme Christian things, and they would say this is essentially psychotherapy. Right? I was raised being told that other people get to tell me what to do with my body and so forth, and I'm blasphemy is training my brain to reject that. So I understand why they do that, and I don't have actually a moral objection to it, but I don't want to participate in blasphemy. And I don't want to set Bibles on fire and do these kinds of things. And I wouldn't do that with any religious symbol. I also find that growing up Catholic, it's a muscle memory. If I walk into a church, my right hand will just start doing its thing. Right? I don't think about it. Right? That just happens. Actually, we had a shooting here in Austin after Trump invaded Iran. And someone that I knew from my gym actually was killed in that shooting. And when I heard that he had died, my hand did the thing again. So it's not. We think of religion often in terms of there are these propositions, these intellectual propositions, and you either believe in them or you don't. But that's not the way that religion actually works. It's actually in our
Yeah.
all the way in our like our nervous system, right?
Yeah, one of our earlier guests, Mark Vernon, said no one before the early modern period would have actually said, I believe in a church. That's something the priest says at the start of the credo, and your actual religious life would be something much more embodied, would be taking part in the community, in the ritual practices of the community, being part of, being part of something much more lived. And I suppose it's a side effect of living in a general sort of atomized, individualistic, neoliberal environment that the most fundamental thing in religion at the moment feels like profession, that personal profession of belief, as you said, in a set of propositions.
That's right, because most religions don't work the way Christianity does. Christianity says belief is absolutely everything. If you don't believe everything on this list, you're not in our church, you're in some other church. But most religious communities around the world are simply about do you show up, right? Who shows up and who carries on these traditions. So one thing I try to teach my students in world religions is you do realize there's something rather unique about Christianity that you wouldn't know unless you compare it to other practices.
Yeah. Well, it was wonderful speaking with you, Joe. We'll just wind it to an end there. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks so much for having me.